Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to part two of our A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara series. In the first part, we covered the backstories of all the main characters. Really only went through part one, but the plan with part two here is to cover the rest of the series, try and fly through the main points real quick, and give you guys the takes on the rest of it. So with that being said, I'm Brandon. I guess let's go around the horn and like introduce ourselves here. Rye? I mean, you're kind of below me. Let's give it off, Rye. What you wanna give yourself a little intro here?
Not really. I did it last time, but
I mean, yeah, but you never know if somebody's tuning in for the
it's okay.
first time in part two for some reason.
Yeah. Um, my name's Rye. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, so a bit this genre is a bit out there for me, but it was a terrible read, and I'm excited to talk about it again.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm still Riley. Absolutely brutal to get through, but I am also still excited to discuss it with
It
my
was a tough
buddies.
read for sure. If you're
Yeah,
just
my good
joining us for the
buddies.
first time here.
At least I think Brian's still my good buddy.
Yeah, there was
Do we address this?
drama behind some
This is
drama
a
behind the
this is a
scenes of the
new
pod.
podcast, so
Yeah, we'll do a kind of like a inside the Walking Dead podcast. We'll do an inside the Good Words podcast later on where we
All
dissect the
right.
drama between me and Riley. But I'm still Brian. This book still is terrible. Let's get into it. I guess we should also address that our good buddy Chase is not here
yeah, the
for
guy
part
who
two.
gave us the title of the podcast. If you don't know already, this is the Good Words podcast where five of us white dudes in our mid-20s are going to be trying to discuss serious books in kind of unserious ways, except for this one because this one was rough. But yeah, we're missing Chase. Kind of don't know what's going on there. Try getting a hold of him. I mean, if going forward,
It
if
is
we
what it
are
is.
missing one person, we're missing one person. There's five of us, Hopefully, you get some entertainment out of the four.
Again,
We'll
stay
see.
tuned for the Inside the Good Words podcast for dissection into what happened to Chase.
Sure. Well,
80,
sure.
80% is passing,
Well,
so if we're just
sure.
missing one, eh.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very
fuck 'em.
true.
All right, Brandon, let's get a recap.
All right, so I figure with part two, we already addressed the main characters in the part one that we covered. Like I said, if you're starting in part two, go back and listen to part one first. I mean, it makes sense. Uh, part two, though, I think we're gonna fly through real quick with I think Jude's story, just because Jude's kind of the main driving character of the entire series, if I can phrase it that way. So once we get into part two, we'll fly through this here. We start to learn more about Jude's backstory throughout the ages, I guess. As Jude was growing up, we learned that he was a adopted child that was adopted by a Christian monastery. Uh, and you can imagine there was not great things going on with the Christian monastery. So as Jude was growing up, there were four brothers, and I am kind of spacing on all the different brothers' names. I don't know if anyone can chime in here. The only one that's really relevant is brother Luke going forward. Uh, that
I
face,
think
right?
there was a bunch of them. I mean,
There
I think it
was
was more than that, maybe.
there was four that were specifically mentioned, as well as the father.
Yeah.
Um, but as Jude grew up in this monastery, by the time he was 8 years old, he suffered a lot of abuse and we'll say neglect through his childhood life. There were three brothers that specifically abused him in terms of phys- physicality and sexuality. I, I don't think I said this earlier. I'll probably add this in later. But Jude suffered a lot of sexual and physical abuse throughout his childhood at this Christian monastery. there was one of the four brothers, Brother Luke, who was always his saving grace, had a greenhouse where he allowed Jude to come in and store his possessions there outside of the other brother's knowledge. Brother Luke was the trusted brother at the monastery, and throughout that, Jude learned to trust him. Eventually, Brother Luke took Jude to escape from the monastery. Brother Luke did human traffic Jude throughout his early childhood life, from the time that he was, I believe, 12 years old. I think it says in the book until I think
12 to
he's
16.
12 to 16. Yeah, I was going to
Yeah, I
say
believe.
where Brother Luke did basically, human traffic Jude while staying at different motels across the country and escaping law enforcement like tip-offs. So Jude definitely had a really tough upbringing, and through that we can, I'll just say, allude to the different things that came up because of that, but there was a lot of it. We mentioned in the part 1 that Jude is has a lot of STDs and health issues due to this. Uh,
I will also say, I think something that's interesting to point out real quick is that while Brother Luke was trafficking Jude and essaying Jude all the time, Luke was acting like a father figure and acting
right.
kind of like a boyfriend to Jude, and was saying like this is a means to an end to eventually like buy a house together and
Yeah.
we're gonna get married. And so Luke is like a genuinely evil character, but
Hmm.
this is not a situation where Jude is because he's a child. Jude isn't even really
Right.
aware of how this is going down for that extended period of time. Like he is told that he's going to go to college and they're going to live together in this house, and so that kind of adds a layer to the abuse in my mind from that character.
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's when they escaped from the monastery. Brother Luke had pitched this idea of building a cabin in the woods to Jude. And it's like, you and I are going to be. Brother Luke framed it as like an older brother situation at first before they escaped from the monastery. And then from there, took into a full on essay human trafficking level. And not only that, almost acted like Jude was his lover, where there were, I hate to say it, but like there were mentions of Jude and Brother Luke where Brother Luke was like, I mean, you're selling your body to these other men, but whenever you and I are together, that's love, not like
Mm.
service like you're doing with these other men. We'll move past that real fast because that's really rough.
Well, I also think that has a lot to do with his intimacy issues in the future, though.
Oh,
Yeah,
100%. That's why I wanted to bring
yeah.
it up now, and we'll get into it. Uh as this goes, by the time Jude reached 16 years of age, brother Luke's there was basically this sting operation. They broke into the motel room, saved Jude from that. He went to a foster care situation where he was living in a adoption agency, and the I don't know what the word for it would be, but the I guess caretakers uh, at the adoption agency recognized that Jude was had these issues and continued to abuse him in the adoption agency in the same way. Uh, After a little bit of time there, Jude ended up having one opportunity where he was almost adopted by a farming family who wanted to adopt them basically as slave labor. And that fell through. That affected Jude's psychology greatly. From there, he ended up escaping from the adoption agency where one of the counselors that was watching over him, who was doing these essay activities, you know, I he ended up stealing his wallet, taking all the cash, and went on the run. Ended up going through hitchhiking scenarios where he was traveling with truckers across the country, and again using his body as a form of travel. And there is one specific mention later in the book where Jude brings up, I don't know why I continued to do that as a means to an end. I had the money. I could have just bought a Greyhound bus ticket, and yet that was all that I knew, and I continued to do this, which really gives you an insight into his psychological state at the time. Now, this is Jude's entire, just the main points of his backstory. There is one other thing where, as he's going across country, traveling through these truckers, I believe that he was falling, like sleeping on a bench at a truck stop, wakes up in the back of a car, uh, is taken in by Dr. Trailer, who will come to learn that's the only name that he gets. He wakes up again in a basement, and he was basically taken by like a Jeffrey Dahmer esque serial killer, who gave him the name of like Dr. Trailer, kept him in his basement for weeks at a time. Like it was multiple weeks. Eventually takes him out to a field, tells him to run, is falling behind him in a car, ends up telling Jude, like, if you fall again, I'm gonna kill you, basically. And as Jude falls again from pure exhaustion, he runs him over with the car. That's how we learn that Jude's leg injuries came to be. Um, from there, that was Jude's childhood. Not typical childhood. That is why JB was giving him so much shit for not talking about his childhood, because who would want to talk about that, obviously? And again, this is stuff that we kind of cover in part one. Now, going into the rest of the book, as the rest of the friend group establishes their careers, they all become ultra successful. Uh, Jude himself is out of a relationship, never pursuing anything through understandable trauma. Basically, he is relatively asexual through this trauma. Eventually, him and Willem establish they have a very, I guess, intimate relationship, even though they're not in an intimate relationship at this point. Willem goes away pursuing his acting career. At this point in the story, Willem has become a very successful actor. JB is a very successful artist. Malcolm is a very successful architect. Dr. Andy, what's his last name?
Contractor? wasn't it?
Contractor. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Andy Contractor is a orthopedic surgeon and Jude's main physician. Going from here, Jude himself is a very successful lawyer. He ends up leaving the attorney general's office, which he is working for in New York City, to pursue private law through a corporation. At this point in the story, Willem leaves on a multi-month long shoot, and as Jude doesn't have Willem to fall back on, ends up pursuing this relationship with another gentleman named Caleb, who he meets at. Well, let me backtrack real quick. As Jude is in college, one of his professors, uh, somebody hit me on his name real quick.
Harold.
Harold. Yeah. So, Jude's professor Harold, they end up establishing a very close friendship. Harold ends up adopting Jude just for like, I don't know what the word for it would be. I guess inheritance purposes. From there, Harold sets Jude up with a AG office internship. He's doing very well. He leaves the AG's office, Attorney General in New York's office, to pursue a career in private law. Makes a ton of money. From there, Willem ends up leaving on a multi-month long photo shoot or video shoot for a new movie. Jude ends up getting into a relationship with a gentleman named Caleb. Caleb is, I mean, we'll put it very succinctly that he's extremely abusive. Full on beats the tar out of Jude, throws him down a flight of stairs, almost kills him on 2 different occasions. Eventually They break up. Harold realizes Caleb was the one who did it to him. Wants to kill Harold, or wants to kill Caleb, and gets in touch with Andy to talk about like literally killing Caleb. Never ends up coming to pass. From there, Willem and Jude get into a relationship, end up living through the happy years. There is much foreshadowing throughout here, but Willem and Jude establish a relatively normal relationship, even though Jude is asexual and does not pursue sexual means with Willem, allows Willem to pursue other sexual conquests. Uh, from there, there is a point where Willem and Malcolm, another character who's long forgotten about at this point, honestly, are in a car for Thanksgiving dinner, getting T-boned by a truck. Both of them die. It sends Jude off into a spiral off the deep end. The book ends basically with Jude committing suicide and Harold telling the story through his perspective as his adoptive father. Okay, I know that was a lot. That was heavy as hell, but that is the rest of the story with the main points kind of out of the way from Jude's perspective. There's so much more shit that happens in the meantime. I want you guys to chime in here though. Bring it in. Bring it in where you want to bring it in based on all that, basically.
Okay. I think coming into this episode, I had one big thing I wanted to talk about. And so I've been toiling since I started reading this book and got through this book. And now we are about 2 weeks removed from me finishing this book, I believe, because we did the first episode last week. I've been kind of wondering why I did not like this book. Like why this book did not hit the same way. I think of the five of us, probably enjoy is a weird word. I probably did not find it to be as high quality as the other four of you guys, but also found there to be some things that I did enjoy. I think the one thing that I did not like, and we hit on it very briefly, is I don't think that the characters, and in particular Jude, make any growth from the beginning of the book to the
100%.
end of the book.
Mhm.
And I think I've also kind of thought of a way, not to tell the author how to do her job, but I've kind of thought of a way to fix that problem. I think this book goes, in my mind, from a kind of a weird, unrealistic book where the characters don't make growth to a much better telling of this story. If when we flash to like Jude and the group at 27, if from that point to the end of the book where Jude commits suicide, Willem and Malcolm die, if it's over the course of like 5 years instead of over the course of like 30.
Yeah.
And so obviously there would be some things that you kind of have to tweak, but because we are getting the same voices of characters and the same thought processes of characters from when they were 27 to when they're 53, it feels like there is no growth or change. There's nothing in the world that has allowed them to grow or change. And so they continuously are trapped in toil in their own torment and trauma. And I feel like if you had shortened the time span from, like I said, 40 years, 30 years to instead like 5, I think this book hits a lot better and makes me feel a lot better about Jude because, and again, we alluded to this last time. I want you guys to eventually chime in here, but like Jude towards the end of this book kind of starts to annoy me in a way.
Yeah.
He, like we talked about it with Andy, where when Andy retires, he throws a fit. And this is a 53-year-old man who throws a fit that you would
Right.
expect from like a 27-year-old
Now,
or like a 30-year-old with like severe mental health issues. But this is a 53-year-old man who
Right.
is at this point well adjusted to society because he is the most successful lawyer. And I
Right.
think that would, I'll let you 1 second. I got one more thing to say about that because I think the change, what it also does is I think it fixes my other problem, which is that all of these characters, despite all of that trauma, are the most successful people at their positions.
Mhm.
And that is also very frustrating to say, okay, these characters have not grown or changed from the time that they were in college, but also, despite the fact that they're always dealing with all this shit, they're also the most successful people of all time. They're rich, they have multiple houses, and they go on vacations to foreign countries and spend weeks and months in these foreign countries. I mean, Willem's a goddamn like Oscar winning movie star. And I think that kind of like it ruins the book for me in a way where I can overlook a lot of the other stuff, but I can't overlook the fact that these characters do not change, and despite that are filthy stinking rich. So
Mhm.
I want to know what your guys' take on that is. Tell me I'm an idiot if you need to, but that's kind of where I'm at, standing at the end of this book after having time to process it. That's my biggest flaw, and I think will continue to be my biggest flaw with this book.
I mean, I agree 100%. However, I personally think that's kind of the point of like it's almost like the fact that they don't deal with these traumas is what drives them to be as successful as they are because they're using that as like a masking technique of like I'm not going to address any of this other shit. I'm just going to be like workaholic and like just go fucking hard in my designated career. I think that's almost kind of the point.
And yes, and I think Jude, to be fair, does say that a few times
Yeah.
where he is, especially after Willem dies, where he's like, "Yeah, I'm working 6 days a week, and then on Sunday I'm not leaving my bed, and then I'm working 6 days a week again."
Mhm.
But up until that point, it doesn't really seem like that is necessarily the case, especially because they are all, well, not all of them, but Willem and Jude are artists, and Malcolm is an architect. We don't get any information about Malcolm, so I shouldn't even talk about him. He's basically not a character in this book. But then Jude is like hinted at being like this savant genius character who doesn't really even need to work because he's so successful
Mm.
and smart. Um, and the other thing I'll say is like, is that even realistic? And what message is the book trying to send that you can like outwork your trauma and
I
outwork your
mean,
mental health problems?
I I do think it's realistic in the sense that like you see that so often in like some of the most successful people in the public eye where like I mean I'll throw this out there but like South Park dives into this of like all these like crazy high celebrities are like they have this like real shit like problems where it's like either like it seems like they're closeted homosexuals themselves or like you know what I mean like this other stuff that they're covering up for seems to be like a common thing. I almost feel like the author was like playing on that herself. But I mean, I do want to step back here though. I'm curious what like Riley and Rye think about this. Honestly, I haven't heard from you two as much.
I I think the lack of character progression is really due to a very poor pre-planning phase for the book. We did talk about how she's more of an explorative approach than somebody that writes it all down in advance and thinks about the plot and how the pacing's gonna work and all that stuff. I truly just think she never once thought about the character growth at all and just wrote
Mm.
them. And then if they changed, it was just because it happened organically in her writing process, not because she actually thought about it. I don't know. I don't know
Yeah,
if we're really looking for a reason here, but I think that is part of it.
no, I agree with that. And I think one of the things Brian and I have talked about off the podcast is that we have this scene with Jude and JB and Malcolm and Willem. You know, it's all four friends together in a way that we haven't seen in a long, long time throughout the entire book, right? And he's having this like whole episode where they're trying to get him to go to rehab, and his drug abuse has really come to a point, right? And in that scene, he ends up making fun of Jude for his physical disabilities, And I think this was the scene specifically where I really came to the realization of this does not feel realistic among a group of friends. And I think, first of all, some of JB's troubles would have been addressed earlier, but also JB, if he were to be in a friend group like this where they're that tight knit, would not actually make fun of Jude in that way. It just doesn't feel realistic that that's how friends would treat each other at that point.
But I will throw this out there that like JB, when he did that, he was going through withdrawal. And he was just full on lashing out of like, I'm hurting, so I'm gonna hurt everyone that's here to like care for me, because he was hurting himself. It was full on projection withdrawal that like I don't necessarily agree that like that part's unrealistic. I do think the lashing out projection part itself was extremely realistic, honestly.
Yeah,
I
but
think it's kind of a two-parter where it's like I agree with Riley. I don't think that Jude or not Jude. I don't think JB would have acted in that way if they were real people. But I also don't think that JB's friends would have taken like that stupid joke and then been like, okay, we're cutting him off for like 7 years. Like we're not going to talk to him for 7 years. And the reason that they all give is yeah, like we love Jude that much. Like Mount Willem is like, yeah, I saw him again. Whatever. And
Right.
Jude,
yeah,
to his credit, is like, no, you guys should continue to be friends with JB because he needs it, and like you should not end a relationship over me. I'm personally not going to stick around because that was offensive to me, but I don't even like, I mean, we're all friends here and we've all made like shitty offensive jokes sometimes. I don't think there's ever anything that we could say to each other at this stage in our friendship where it'd be like, okay, I am never going to see this person. Like, I would never give this person another chance. I would never talk to them again. I'm going to tell all of my friends to never talk to them again for 7 years, especially when they're going through, like, they were there as an intervention
Yeah.
for that character, and then
See,
they
that's
immediately
the
were like,
part I do
"No."
agree with.
yeah. And I think it's a double-edged sword, exactly like you said, right? Like it's just not realistic in this way because in that situation, I don't think JB would have behaved that way, but I also think if he had said that horrible stuff through the withdrawal, right, that they wouldn't hold that against him. Because like
Yeah,
if this was one of us, like you could say the worst things ever to me and I would still be your friend because I would understand that that's what you're going through, right? And I think that just kind of ties into the whole like we go through this entire book,
But
hundreds and hundreds of pages going from their 20s to their 50s, and there's just no growth because I think in these
mhm,
scenarios, the little scenarios that we see throughout the way just don't play out in a way that they actually would within friend groups. And then we just end up with no growth because those growth conversations don't even end up happening through
right.
all of these hardships.
So here's the thing though. I almost feel like you have to look at the characters, even though that like by the point JB does that, they're in their what, like 30s, 40s.
I mean,
I
at minimum, yeah.
because there is no growth, because they had never acknowledged each of their individual traumas, I almost feel like you have to look at them like they're all like 16, 17. And if they were 16, 17, that would be like perfectly understandable. You know what I mean? Where it's
But that's
like,
what I'm
I
saying. I
don't,
feel
if
like
we,
I feel like that's how we acted when we were 16
well,
and
that's what I'm
17.
saying. But
yes,
like,
yes,
Yeah.
with, in terms of like writing people off or something like that, I feel like if you look at them as if they were younger, like in high school, basically, that's understandable at that point. Where it's like, I mean, shit, we had people that like we used to like associate with that like we wrote off for some like random bullshit, like because it was high school, like you're kids, you don't know. But the fact that they never have this growth and acknowledge their traumas, they are still almost locked in a high school mentality, even though they are these adults that are like top of their field, because they've never acknowledged that. Like you're almost having to look, I personally think you have to look at them as if they are very immature, even though they are older, because that growth never happens.
but it's very contradictory from the author to try and look at them that way, and then to also try and look at them as, oh, they're dealing with all these adult problems, and oh,
Right.
also, by the way, they're the most successful people in their fields.
But
And
that's
I would
also,
also
I
I would
honestly
also
feel like
argue that
that's not
it's
uncommon though. Like if you look at like the I mean, honestly, like we can get a
I
little
think the reality
political
is
with
that
it.
we're all fucked up. But
Yeah.
assuming that all, like, the odds of this group of four, like any four people, any four friends that you plucked out of the world, to assume that all of them would have trauma, and to assume that all of them overcome that trauma and become financially successful and find each other, I think is extremely rare to say. Like, obviously, like I said, I think every celebrity has their fucked up stuff, because we
Mhm.
all have fucked up stuff. I
Yeah.
just think the fact that they all somehow knew each other, it also makes
I
it
mean,
unrealistic. And I also think, again, if we have to sit here and like you said, assume or look at these characters like they're 16, 17,
mhm.
I think that kind of goes back to my point, where it's like, yeah, you should have just written these characters as 16 or 17,
Right. No, and
or
that's the part
shorten
that
the
I agree
span.
with
Yeah,
100%.
shorten
Yeah.
the timeline
I
to where
fully
we're
agree
not
with
dealing
that.
with 30-year-olds who are getting upset about, what amounts to like a shitty, disabled person impression, or whatever the fuck JB was trying to do.
Mhm.
So we're being really critical, but it's still a Booker Prize finalist. What what do we actually think the reasoning is for it making it that far in that
Okay,
competition? Is it
see,
really just good words, or is
this is why we need Chase, right? This is why we need Chase, because if Chase were here, he would talk about the actual words, right?
Mhm.
Because I think one of the things that like this book is well known for is the prose and the
Yeah.
actual like writing itself.
And
I
that's
think
something
it
that Chase
is
touched
good,
on in part one, which is, yeah, it is, she is a phenomenal writer when it comes to the prose and the actual style.
but I think that's
It's
what it's about.
everything else. It's
I think it
everything else,
really
Mhm.
bro.
it pulls back to what Brian was saying in the last episode about the author getting in there and saying like, this is, I want to write the darkest book possible, and all the
Mhm.
effort was wordsmithing ways to find, kind of an avenue to describe all the worst things a person can go through, but then the actual plot and the like growth that happens afterwards. And we're assuming we have 3 decades of character involvement at that point, and we just kind of get nowhere with it. The effort of the book is put in towards like just describing awful stuff, and at that point we just kind of get to where like, why? Yeah,
so like what was the goal here?
yeah.
Well, yeah, because at
Honestly,
the
I
end of
think
it, she just
Snoke
kills them all.
touched on
So
this at the beginning or like in part one of the fact that like she had mentioned in an interview that she wanted to write the darkest book possible. I think that was the goal, honestly, was
yeah,
just that was it though. Like, and
So
nothing else
why?
besides that. Like,
So to circle back to Rye's question, with that information, why is this book so successful? If a lot of the things that I look for in a story and look for in a good novel are kind of missing or muted, but it's just like the darkest shit. Like, what does
yeah.
that say about us? Like, why was this successful in the
people love to
time
be
period of?
miserable.
And this book was written in 2015.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, yeah,
not
I
to
think
get
it's,
political, but let's think about where the world was in
yeah,
2015.
right. And I think, I mean, look at just even like TV shows, things that are like big on like Netflix, like actual like streaming platforms, right? Like things like Grey's Anatomy, where it is literally episode after episode after episode, Criminal Minds, right? Of like all the worst stuff that could happen. And we just watch it and we
Mhm.
don't even think about it, right? And I think that's kind of the part I'm getting to as I'm getting older, right? Like I see this stuff and it just feels awful. Um, and I think books like this, I would have been, you know, I think if I was like 20, I would have read it and been like, wow, this is really deep. Like, I think this it's a really good take on like trauma and growing up. And now that I'm 27, I'm like, this is maybe not the best portrayal of this. And
Well, let me throw this out there of like I do think it was a really good take on trauma. The only thing is like we are in a more progressive time period even with all the whatever going on. I'm not even going to touch on that. But like in terms of our generation being more open to this, like you touched on this a little bit last time, Riley, where it's like this was written in 2015. Even in 2015, there was not this open dialogue and this open conversation around trauma and mental health and pursuing therapy that there is now. And with that being the case, if that mindset would have continued through the ages, I think you would see a lot more of like what this author was touching on, where it's almost like sci-fi in the way that like it is very indicative of the time period where like 2015 wasn't that long ago. But in terms of like taking the time period and projecting it outwards 30, 40 years in advance, I think it's almost very sci-fi in that way. And I think that's what touched on people where they're like looking around, seeing like, yeah, this is how it is. And it's like, all right, so she's just taking that and expanding upon it. And we're 10 years in the future now, and we're looking at being like, all right, well, 10 years in the future, like this is a much more open dialogue and open conversation than it was 10 years ago. Whereas we're acknowledging this, moving past those things and moving forward and trying to improve. If you would have it's almost like she took the characters and it's like, all right, this is how it is in this time period. We'll expand upon that almost like I said in like a sci-fi way where it's very touching on the time period and expanding out into the future from there. I'm curious of you guys' thoughts around that though.
no, I mean, I think that's a good point. It's just bringing it back to like these characters don't grow and the times don't change. And, we can assume that, once we get into Jude's 50s, it's probably somewhere in the realm of 2040, maybe, right? Something like that. And I I'm an optimist, so I can't imagine that we just still don't have therapy in 2040.
Right. But that's where I was saying, like, it's almost like a sci-fi book where it's like taking what current future hope is. But like in her case, it's not future hope, it's future cynicalism, I guess. Of like if this continues the way it's showing to be right now, these are the problems we're going to be dealing with in 30 years. And I almost feel like that's that's the angle that she took of like if shit stays the exact same as it is right now, here's how it's going to go.
And yet the author doesn't touch on like the Black Lives Matter movement, which like
In 2015 though, would you
it started in
I
2015. That was
right,
the
but
Freddie
I
Gray
don't know
Baltimore
if
City riots. That
I
was when Black Lives Matter kind of kicked off,
straight up
and
though,
none of the
I don't
characters
think
addressed it. None of the characters
legitimately
talked
from a
about it. They're
personal
all black
experience
too,
though,
mostly.
I don't think we really heard about that outside of like you know what I mean? Like I don't want to
But that is, I think that is one example in my mind of like if that was the thing that she was going for, she misses the mark pretty severely because she doesn't talk about any of the other possible things that could happen. It really does feel like she wanted to write a character piece on like these four characters and then found that in her mind Jude was the most interesting of them and kind of took that and
I just
ran
ran with it,
and
yeah.
just did a character study of one guy that is has a shitty life, no lie, but is also a flawed human being, and as we've kind of been discussing, does not handle his trauma well, does not go to therapy, does
And
not
he's enabled the entire
grow
time
in
too.
any way,
Like
and he's enabled in
people that he thinks are actually helping him are just enabling him. like his closest
Right.
connections that to him seem to be a help are actually a hindrance and they're just enabling.
I
Right.
do
Right.
think I do think the average reader, not that they'd have a good time reading it, but would have a casual reader would probably not have as many issues as us reading it. I mean, we're
Yeah.
going in here
Right.
to be critics. The
Right.
imagery of all of these horrible traumas is good. We're finding all of the good, bad descriptive
Yeah.
word there, but um,
Welcome to
very
the Good Words
poor.
podcast. No.
Yeah,
Right.
that's what we're here for. No, but I think if you're just there to experience the trauma, knowing that's what the book's about, and not sit here and critique every aspect of it,
Mhm.
I think you would say it's a very, very, very high quality book.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
because of how much research and effort goes into describing
Right.
the traumas and really picking that part apart, I think it's a high quality book. Everything else being considered makes it not seem that way. We certainly
Yeah.
don't think that, but
Yeah. I'm a very critical person, and I think that
Yeah, we
obviously
know.
plays
yeah.
into it.
Yeah, we know, buddy. Don't
Jesus
worry.
I
Christ.
guess
Oh
I'm just
my
here trying to
God.
explain it away a little bit, but
No,
I do
that makes
think,
sense. If that's
yeah,
what you're reading for, that's what the book is good for.
well,
I
it
But
does.
I
It
kind of
kind of hoodwinks you though, because like we
I mean,
talked
it
about last
does.
time,
Yeah.
yeah.
you can't get that from the back of the book. So
Mhm.
Right. Which is probably my third problem is that the description sucks, but we talked about that already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To go back to what you were saying, Rye, I kind of felt like when I was describing this book to my partner, and she would often be like, "Why do you keep reading this? Like,
Yeah.
why are you continuing to read this?" I kind of thought about. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the show This Is Us on CBS, but the show This Is Us. Not to get into a recap of that show, is I've only seen bits and pieces of it, but every episode feels like there is some intensely emotional moment that the characters deal with some intense pain or
Mhm.
trauma or abuse or grief or something that happens in their lives, and it almost feels like the show is there just to give people a good cathartic cry.
Mhm.
And I feel like like that show is incredibly successful. And so I feel like the reason that this book is successful is that it kind of gives people that
Okay.
feeling,
I
that vibe of
honestly,
like, we're going to cry and be sad and upset
mhm.
about something for a little bit.
Let me throw
yeah, I
this
think
out there. I almost think that that is why this book is successful in terms of like written in 2015 at that point where people were like acknowledging their mental health. If you can get a good like cathartic cry like you said out of it where it's like you're acknowledging these feelings where it's like you might be connecting with one of these four characters in the book through like one of their multiple different traumas. I almost feel like that's what it is where it's like she touches on almost every trauma through one of these characters in some small way that like if you can get it out
Mm.
through reading this book and acknowledging it and you're not acknowledging it in any other part of your life, it can be cathartic. I almost feel like that's why this book found the success that it did, where it's like, I
hmm,
there are these characters, and it's like you can maybe relate to like this character's one small thing, or you can relate to this character's one small thing and acknowledge it.
Right.
I almost feel like that's where it finds its
Right.
success.
I
You know what I
agree,
mean?
and the reason why it was a finalist and not the winner that year is because of everything else we said.
Hmm.
Every other harshness we threw at it. So.
um, yeah. So I've managed to hit on biggest my biggest
Yeah,
complaints. Is there anything else anybody wants to talk about this book? Anything that is burning in their hearts and minds?
I mean, I feel like we've summed it up really well. I feel like we're pretty collectively agreeing on it. Um, I think the ending is just kind of ties it all together, where in just one chapter and a few sentences, everybody dies, and
Right.
Basically,
I
everyone
just
but
think it
like
is
JB,
so
Harold, and Julia. They're like the only three
yeah.
like main characters alive at the end.
And I just think it's so disrespectful to Malcolm, where he just kind of they just threw it was like
Malcolm's
one
like
sentence.
not even a character in this book,
Yeah,
honestly.
Well,
and they're just like,
yeah.
oh yeah, he was also in the car and he also died.
Well,
And then
also his wife.
we get to this point where it's like, okay, Jude dies, and then so does everybody else pretty closely after, except for Harold, who is now grieving the loss of two sons.
And is forced to
And
bear witness to
this is
every-
almost this is something that I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit is those last two chapters of the book where it switches to Harold's perspective.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
put yourself in his shoes.
Yeah.
And you're the oldest character in the book, and you have to
At this
outlive
point, he's almost
all of
90 years
these-
old. Like,
Yeah, you have to outlive basically all of your children and watch all of this terrible shit happen, then be explained post mortem Jude's trauma, right? And that
Right.
mhm.
Right.
then-
Well, and that's where like that note
how did
that
he
like
not have a heart attack at
So,
any of these
yeah.
phases?
that note that Harold finds though, Jude left it in his bookcase when he was 20 years old. Harold found it when he was what, 80, 90 years old, something like that. But it was in there for like 50, 60 years, something like that. I don't know. It was like when he was
Was-
30, he wrote the
okay.
note.
That was a detail that I had missed.
I went
because
back to it because I was curious. Jude
it was
wrote this
right
note
after-
and he left it in Harold and Julia's bookcase, but never told them
after-
about it. Harold
Okay,
and
was this
Julia
after the-
found it after Jude killed himself.
Was this after the first suicide attempt? Was this the letter that he wrote then? At that point, do we know that, or do you not remember? I missed that too. Led you because
Yeah.
right before it tells you that Jude kills himself, Harold asks him, like, you don't have to tell me this, but can you please write this down? Like, can
Right.
you write down your story at some point? You don't have to tell me. And Jude says, I will. And then Harold immediately goes to Jude killed himself like later. And so that's why I was like, oh, he wrote that story as one last kind of like, fuck you to Harold. That's what
Oh.
it kind of feels like, because it's
He
like,
wrote it
oh,
the
by the way, I killed myself because I like there was nothing else to live for. There's nothing you could have done, and also here's all of the abuse and trauma I've gone
so
through.
there
over
was
the last
that,
50 years.
but the note that I'm talking about, Jude wrote the day of the adoption. He wrote his
Yeah, I remember
whole
how he
childhood
never
story
gave it
down
to
the
them.
day of the adoption, never gave to him, but that was the one that I'm pretty sure he hid in Harold and Julia's bookcase, and they didn't find it until after he killed
Okay.
himself.
If
30,
you're right,
40
then
years
kudos
later.
to you. Because
Yeah.
I feel like I might have been reading too fast.
I
and it seems
had
was just a
I
suicide
went
note.
back to it because I
Right.
made the connection. I was like, when was this road actually written?
Okay.
Because
Either
there
way,
were two.
Terrible experience for Harold.
There were two where like Jude killed himself at the very end, and there was that one note, and I think it pointed to the other letter saying like, "Hey, look in your
Okay.
bookcase. There's this other
Mm.
one," and that's my
Okay.
other story.
But yeah, like what a even still, what a really shitty thing from Jude to do. You know, we don't have to get into the whole thing of like, is suicide selfish? Is it selfish? We don't have to get into that debate, but even just to leave a note where there is no like it like Jude was apologizing a whole bunch, obviously, but just the way that it ended, it felt like it put a lot of darkness on Harold. There was like a line where he says something like, I've never felt love, or like something like that, something that made Harold be like, oh, I can't believe that he died not knowing that I loved him, like died not feeling any love from me.
hmm
And even outside of all the other shit that we've talked about, Jude, what a terrible way to kind of end your life and
Yeah.
to end your legacy. It's just shit like that that makes me not like Jude as a character. I'm not gonna lie, and it's tough with all the abuse and trauma leading up to him as an adult. But like Harold is one of the like nicest.
I
most
think he's the
benevolent
best character in the
characters I've
book,
ever
honestly.
read in a book. Like he is so nice and so genuinely sweet. and for the book to end with him kind of like being swallowed by Jude's darkness via that suicide note is brutal, man. That is brutal.
Well,
But it's
there
not
are a lot
only
of people that
that. Go ahead, Rai. Sorry.
I was gonna say there are a lot of people that say some of the worst things you could experience in life is outliving your children. So maybe this is just more along the lines of we're gonna write the worst shit out there and make you experience it.
Jesus Christ. I'm like,
I mean,
yeah,
Yeah.
probably, but like,
right
what
till
the
the last
fuck?
page,
I
it seems like she was just
I
trying to
agree.
describe the worst stuff.
Yeah. But like
That's a
from
good
that
point.
angle though, Harold has a lot of undealt with trauma himself. He lost his first child. And
Yeah.
they never dealt with that. And he adopted Jude as a surrogate of like if his first child lived, he would have been around the same age as Jude. So it's like it's more
Right.
undealt with trauma that like instead of dealing with it, they're just finding
Yeah.
Yeah.
these filters. And it's like that's the main theme of this book in my mind of just undealt with trauma nonstop continuously throughout the entire goddamn thing. Like,
Yeah. And I
That's all it
think
is.
the author probably was like, what's worse than watching one of your kids die? Two.
yeah.
Okay, that's terrible. Why would you do that? But it fits the theme of the book, just
Yeah.
exploring the worst dramas imaginable. So yeah,
Right.
Well, and somebody put this forward earlier of it's almost like what I don't even remember what the line was or like who said it, but like somebody had put out there of it's almost like the dealing with trauma from a person who's never had traumas to that extent of like this is a way to like associate the worst trauma without ever having
Right.
dealt with it or like gone through it yourself. And it's like to just gain that empathetic perspective of like
yeah,
people who
Right.
have gone through it.
it's definitely a perspective finder because
Hmm.
the research was done, and if you want to experience it, you can go out and see it secondhand.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aside from
That's
secondhand, but
that's a more concise way of like getting at what I was
yeah,
trying to get at. But yeah.
Because
yeah,
we've talked about how if you did go through any of the stuff that these characters go through, this would not be something that you would want to read because it describes it in such a
yeah,
brutal and I said romanticized, voyeuristic, whatever Riley prefers,
Mhm.
but describes it in such a intense way that you're like, damn, like you would not want to read this if you were someone who self-harmed. You would not want to read this if you were someone who dealt with child abuse.
Mhm.
and
So this book
yeah,
that
Now,
tells you who this book is for at that point. I think in particular the moment that I kind of related to because it was such a niche moment was at the very end when right after Willem dies and we get Jude's perspective on kind of grief and he's
mhm.
talking about how um he doesn't want to like wear out one of the shirts too quickly. Like he wants to
Yeah.
make sure
Yeah.
he cherishes the shirts equally, and he wants to make sure that he's watching the movies equally. He doesn't want to burn them
Mhm.
out so that he's tired of seeing them, but he wants to appreciate them. And how he has to create these stories in his mind of okay, well, he's filming a movie in space. He's not actually dead. He's filming a movie in space. That's why he can't
Mhm.
talk to me, and that's how I'm going to deal with my grief for the first 8 months after he dies. I think that those feelings of like just like little weird things you do to get over
Right.
losing somebody, I extremely related to. I think the like sort of the problem is that you go from that and then because Jude is such a flawed character and Jude is a character who has refused um any sort of help with his mental health is that then he spirals to the point where he ends up committing suicide instead of continuing to deal with his grief in that way,
Right.
which is a normal way to deal with grief in my
Mhm.
mind. So I hear what you're saying. I think those moments for me were far and few between, but that one really stuck in my mind.
Right. And
But there were
that's
other
kind of what
things
I
that I
was
was
trying
like,
to
no.
touch on. Where like yeah, there's so much shit that like she dives so hard where she puts so much on these four characters that's super unrealistic. However, if you look at the micro scale of it, there are identifiable moments depending on the character and depending on your own, I guess, lived experience. There are these micro moments where it's like, all right, I relate to this character through this thing. I relate to this character through this thing. And I almost feel like that's why this book was as successful as it was, because there are these like micro identifiable moments through the different characters. And it's unrealistic in the sense that it's like all this shit put on these four characters, but it's like, all right, like this one little micro thing with this character, I really relate to. And it's super fucking realistic with this one thing that, like, their inner monologue is just super identifiable. And then she goes into this other thing. It's like, all right, this thing with this character is super relatable, super identifiable. And, like, I feel like there's these jump around moments of identifiable self traumas that like the characters don't deal with in the book like at all, but through my own lived experience I was able to be like, there are these little things here and there that like I identify with and like connect with, and I feel like that's where people connect with this book is through those moments.
Yeah. When you look at it as a whole, it's unbelievable.
Hmm.
But I think there are enough tragic events in there. Take the fatal car crash one, for example.
Yeah, I mean we've
A
all
large
gone
amount of our
through
audience
this.
can relate
Yeah.
to
Mhm.
tragedy in a car accident. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's a
all of
very
us knew
relatable. I
somebody
was
in
gonna
high
say, like,
school.
we've all gone through that ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, like and there's going to be a huge amount of our audience that can relate to one day they knew a person and the next day they didn't exist
Right.
anymore because they were in a fatal
Mhm.
car crash. So
Right. Yeah.
even if you didn't experience the worst of the worst in this book, and trust me, there's a lot, you probably could relate to some of the minor tragic events. So it's just when it's all combined together, you can't believe
Right.
that this much terribleness could happen to these four people.
Right.
Right. Right.
I
Last
think
thoughts? Any last thoughts?
I don't know
Do
about
we
last
want to
thoughts.
do?
Final rating out of 10 for this book.
Okay.
I want to touch on two things here. What would you rate this book out of 10, and would you recommend it to somebody else? If not, why? Or if you would, why?
What are the criteria? Is just general rating out of 10?
Just straight
Vibes.
up general
Vibes.
rating out of 10. Yeah,
Vibes,
vibes.
yeah.
Straight,
Vibes,
straight,
all
straight
vibes.
vibes.
Eh,
Like, what are your vibes with this
But
book?
everyone knows the rule.
Did you like straight up out of 10, like did you like this book or did you not like this book? Absolutely hated this fucking book. Barely got through it. Loved the fuck out of this book. Like flew through it from like 0 like 1 to 10. Let's start there. Snook,
I could
what do you
start.
think?
Yeah.
I mean, I was
I'll,
gonna say,
All
well,
right.
I'll just go. I'm going in a circle here, so like,
Okay.
at
No,
this
it's all right.
point,
We'll let Brian. We'll let Brian do it. It's fine.
I mean, he's in my
shut the
top left
fuck
right
up,
now.
dude. Jesus. Again, save it for the after show. I would personally give this book a super strong 5 out of 10. I think that there are valuable moments. I think the prose is great. However, I've obviously been super critical about a lot of this book, and I would not recommend it to anybody. I think if you're looking for a book about mental health, if you're looking for a book about trauma, if you're looking for a book about male friendship, there are better places to do that. There are better books that will give you that. There are better authors to tackle some of those topics. I will say, not that I want to be too critical of her as a person, but there are better authors to tackle those topics. So I would not recommend it. But I would be interested to kind of look at some of her other work that isn't as bleak. So those are my final thoughts on A Little Life.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I honestly would put this book at like a 7 out of 10 in terms of, so this is why I like touch on those issues of those relatable moments of, again, the characters in the book don't deal with this trauma, but like you kind of learn that perspective of like, if you don't deal with this trauma, this is what the fuck happens. So it's almost like a cautionary tale of like, if you can get through the book itself and learn from it in terms of like, if I don't deal with this shit, it's gonna be bad. So like, let's identify some stuff, let's deal with it. There are certain traumas in the book that I would just be like, all right, if you've experienced anything close to some of this shit, absolutely not. Do not touch this book. Like, no. But still, like, I would say a 7 out of 10. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody per se, but like, I do think it was a valuable read. Rive, what you got?
I'll give it a 3 out of 10.
Oh, super low.
That's my vibe check. And I would never, if somebody brought it to me saying they were thinking about reading it and I had read it and what was my opinion, I would disclaimer it a ton, but I would never outright just suggest it to somebody looking for something to read. It's
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
like
But yeah,
if you've encountered any trauma in your life, probably don't read it, because unless you're willing to out what your trauma was, I'm just going to assume it was covered in the book and you're going to have a bad time. The reason I say 3 out of 10 is just you can't look back on it and be like, yep, somebody could experience all of this horribleness. There was no character in the book that had really a good outcome. Just, I don't know, not my cup of tea.
I agree. I
Really
like
at a
I
loss
said,
for
my
words
whole
as
thing was
to
like
why it was terrible.
cautionary tale. And that's
Yeah,
why it's like I go higher with it, just because, again, like I said, cautionary tale of like,
Yeah, cautionary
a
tale.
7?
Don't get
Yeah.
abused as a 12-year-old.
Well, no, but like it's not only that, it's like the refusal to deal with it or acknowledge any of it.
I got you. I got you.
Yeah. Riley, what's your thoughts?
I don't know. I started at like 6.8, and then as I've been listening, I've slowly lowered it. I think I'm at 5.7 with the caveat of 5 of the stars are for quality of writing and the prose. Shout out to Chase.
Mhm.
And the 0.7 stars, I'm giving it for everything else, because I mean there was a lot there, but also at the same time it was just brutal for brutal sake, and I can't get behind that kind of stuff. I just
Yeah.
it's not. I think there's a story here. I think this could have been really well written in a different way, but I think the way that it is currently at, that's a 0.7 stars for me.
Yeah. Okay. And now with that being said, we do this ranked choice voting system where like all of us submit a book in terms of like picking what our book's going to be for the book club. Our next book is going to be I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. A little bit of a lighter tale. However, I mean there's some heavy subjects in there, but that was the book that we all decided on for our next touch. Hopefully we have Chase back with us next time. We'll see. Other than that, though, does anyone have any final thoughts? Leaving this off here.
I'd like to propose maybe like the Magic Treehouse or Berenstein Bears for our third book. Just to kind of
Super light, super light.
even it out a little bit here.
I mean, yeah.
Wait, hold on.
What
How
you got?
Fox and Socks.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I bet that
Rye,
Fox goes Fox in
our
that book.
father of
I
the
bet he
group.
does.
Yeah.
I just read it this morning, so I can verify that it is a good read. Certified good read.
You better put that on your story graph or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Fox
Yeah.
book.
Story graph.
Yeah. Well,
All right, let's
right.
end
I
this
mean, this
nightmare.
I was gonna say this was we'll say a tough one. We'll leave it at that. But
Yep.
hopefully, I mean, if you guys are still here with us, I don't expect anybody to be, because this was a tough conversation. But if you are, hopefully you join us for our second book, like I said, I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. That's where we're gonna be coming back with you with. And yeah, this was a really rough start, thanks to the plot summary on the back of the book not being that great. But we got through it. Hopefully, you found some interesting perspectives, interesting takes here, and hopefully, we'll see you next time. If not, I'd understand because this was tough. I mean, shit. But all right, peace.